This week on The Wheelhouse, a looming government shutdown. And a little later, drama at the ballot box. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond, right here. You're about to get a quick lesson on how our federal government works. And spoiler alert, it's pretty political. Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives are fighting. They can't agree on what to do about government spending going forward. And federal Democrats, they might reject whatever comes their way. All the while we wait to see if the government shuts down and some of us go on furlough. Later on, we're going to talk to you about drama at the ballot box in Bridgeport. But first, we got to dive into the fight to fund the federal government and how Connecticut residents could be impacted. And with us is my favorite, your favorite. She joins us essentially from Capitol Hill. Lisa Hagan, federal policy reporter for the Connecticut Mirror and Connecticut Public. Good morning, Lisa. How are you?
Hey, Frankie. Doing well down here.
I hope so. I hopefully not as chilly down there as it is up here.
Yeah, a little warmer than Connecticut.
A little bit warmer than Connecticut, of course, and hopefully you're enjoying that. Right now, if you're enjoying the show, please give us a call, 888-720-9677. Maybe you got some questions about this topic. You want to know a little bit more about how things are going to be impacted in Connecticut. If there's a shutdown, give us a call, 888-720-9677. We want to hear from you, especially if you are somebody who is a federal worker. Lisa, my first question. Everyone's hearing about a congressman named Kevin McCarthy. Why is he at the forefront of this thing?
He is the Speaker of the House, so he basically runs the House side of things in Congress. And so he's the one at the forefront when they're trying to pass major legislation, like trying to fund the government and prevent a shutdown. And so he's, again, always at the forefront of all this current drama over funding the government. And he's basically trying to appease a right flank of his party that is demanding a lot, but at the same time having to figure out how they would even compromise because Democrats control the Senate and the White House. So he's in a bit of a precarious position to make his party happy, keep his job, and also keep the government running.
So again, the Republicans have the majority then in the House. So can you just give me an idea of who in the House is kind of pushing back against McCarthy?
Yeah. So he has on both sides of Congress, both parties have really slim majorities, which is why, again, this is even more complicated because you can only lose so many votes if you don't get help from the other party. So with McCarthy in the House, he has, a number of detractors. There's been a few people kind of going in and out, voting for funding bills and pulling support. One of the people kind of at the center of this is Matt Gaetz, who is a congressman from Florida. And so it's these kind of ultra conservative people, lawmakers on the right who want to cut funding and who think that any kind of compromise legislation is just basically it's a non-starter for them. And without their support and without, again, some support from Democrats who are not going to essentially, quote unquote, bail out Republicans, it makes it really hard to pass anything, and why we're kind of staring down at a possible shutdown at the end of the week.
How many people are going to be impacted by this fight if there's a potential government shutdown?
It would be thousands and thousands of federal workers. In Connecticut specifically, the state has about 8,400 federal workers.
Mm-hmm.
It spans from cabinet level agencies. I think that's basically where a lot of them work. I think it's about 7,900 work for probably regional offices within cabinet agencies. Also larger independent agencies. I know there's some Connecticut workers at the EPA, the Small Business Administration, and it would also affect members of the military, both in active duty, reserve, people in Connecticut who work in a civilian capacity for the Pentagon. And so what's complicated about all this is a lot of people are considered accepted workers. And so they're not really called essential anymore because that's a hard thing to parse. but it's these kind of people who need to run certain things like the military, air traffic control. They will be required to work no matter what. But whether or not they're in that position or they're furloughed, no one's basically getting a paycheck until the shutdown would be resolved.
Eesh. And so you gave us a good sense of the kind of people that are going to be impacted. Understand that the people in the military branches as well, like you said, the Pentagon, but also people at the Coast Guard, at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, workers in the Coast Guard, they would be impacted as well.
Yeah, and from when I've dug into the data a little bit, it seems like the majority of federal workers in Connecticut work for defense-related type of agencies. And so I think nearly half of Connecticut federal employees work for Veterans Affairs. Though I will note for the VA that regardless of a shutdown, VA benefits would get processed. So that's something that would continue regardless of a shutdown. More than a third of workers in Connecticut who, again, federal employees, work for the Pentagon, the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, also Homeland Security, which, again, you mentioned has jurisdiction over Coast Guard. But again, military operations in an essential capacity need to continue. And so a lot of these people will be working, but again, without any income for however long the shutdown would last.
Okay, so let's look beyond maybe the workers. What about the people of Connecticut? What should me and you be thinking about here? If you're telling a story, what kind of people are you going to be thinking about here in the coming weeks?
Yeah, so I'll kind of start with just the major programs that I think people would be most worried about, and these are programs that get mandatory funding and would be okay, though again, completely possible that there would be some disruptions if this lasted for a long time. The last shutdown lasted for 34 days. Sometimes they only last for a few days or a week. So Social Security and Medicare would be okay. SNAP benefits, which was used to be referred to as food stamps, that would be okay for now because that gets funded. Again, totally possible there would be disruptions on that front if this were to go for a long time. Veterans benefits would be okay. But where things start to get a little bit tricky and would probably see cuts pretty immediately or could be affected in a short shutdown, farm loans through the agriculture department. That's really big for Connecticut because a lot of farmers, they operate on small acreage, small farms, and they use federal programs to secure loans. And it's really hard for them to get conventional loans, and they're competing with major developers. So things like that could be halted or probably would be halted. There's about 47,000 beneficiaries in Connecticut who use WIC benefits. That's that nutrition assistance for women, infants, and children for lower income families. That I think would see pretty immediate cuts. Also totally possible, and I talked with a few members, that government contracts could also feel a ripple effect on this if this goes for a long time. And so Connecticut is home to some really big defense contractors, Sikorsky, Electric Boat, Pratt & Whitney. They get billions of dollars in government contracts, and they're funded by Congress, and they have all these funds sitting there waiting to be approved that might not for weeks or a few months. And it's possible that existing government contracts could feel that hurt a little bit too.
God, you did that in less than 2 minutes. It's so important for people to understand how this could impact us. And did you drill a hole in the center of the earth there to try to inform us. Really appreciate that, Lisa. Hey, the U.S. Senate, where Democrats hold the majority, still has to approve this. And the image that I got earlier when you were talking about this is Democrats just sitting there and watching a dumpster fire. And just kind of letting it happen. So is there a possibility that they'll just let the Republicans fight in the House and kind of watch as they mess up in public here? Is there anything they're going to do to kind of help the situation, or are they waiting for a particular package? What are you hearing they're going to do?
Yeah, it's kind of, there's like a two-pronged strategy kind of going on. And the House and the Senate are operating on totally different tracks. And so you have the Senate, which again is controlled by Democrats narrowly, but they're working in a bipartisan fashion. It's not just Democrats trying to figure out a short-term solution. They're getting Republican support from this. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, he is endorsing doing a short-term bill. And so the Senate put out, so basically it's called a continuing resolution, a CR. It is a short-term fix that would keep the government running for weeks, months, however long they need to basically negotiate larger funding for the next fiscal year. And it keeps the government operating at current level. So it wouldn't be it's typically not a reduction in funding or new funding. And so the Senate put that out last night. You've seen some House Democrats get excited about it. Rosa DeLauro, who plays a very important role in appropriations from Connecticut, she supports the Senate CR. Again, it's really up to House Republicans and Kevin McCarthy whether they're going to touch this bill at all or not, and if they could sell it to their conference. It doesn't look likely. Republicans are operating on their own track. It might come to basically they have until late Saturday to do anything. Completely possible. In the last 11th hour, they decide to do something. They decide to pass a CR and to keep the government funding. But as of right now, I don't think Republicans in the House would vote for it.
Okay, so they pass a CR. They avoid a shutdown, and federal lawmakers do it by passing this temporary emergency spending package. I'm talking hypothetically here. Jump with me if you can. If memory serves, I think this happened a few years ago. We'd be in the spot just a few months from now, right? If they did pass a CR, we could potentially be right back here.
Yes, it's a vicious cycle. It just basically kicks the can down the road a few months. It typically lines up with the holidays, which I know is never fun for lawmakers or reporters or anyone, trying to figure this out and obviously put the strain on families when you get close to the holidays. So I think this one would line up in November. Typically, this is dealt with in December a lot of the time, but this would definitely happen later in the year and just put a strain on things further and just basically put things on pause.
Yeah, sometimes I worry about my tone because I'm a very energetic person, but this is very serious when you talk about it lining up with the holidays, because I had the occasion to meet some families that were impacted by the last shutdown. And we met this Coast Guard family, and not only did they have issues with getting money, they had help from the community at large, and then from the federal credit union that was helping out too. And you could tell us how federal credit unions, you might be able to tell us how federal credit unions could help families at this time. But then not only was there an issue with money and trying to save money, and this guy I interviewed, his name was Mike Brzezinski, and trying to get his kid just to go see the Spider-Man movie, and they were on a budget at the time. But then their water pipe in their house broke, and this is all around the holidays. So this is just not something that people want to have, this uncertainty hanging over their heads.
Exactly. And, again, especially awful during the holidays, but no matter when a shutdown happens, it's a lot of these people who would go without pay for some time. I mean, they're federal employees, but a lot of them don't make a ton of money. They do live paycheck to paycheck. You look at a shutdown and you think, okay, it could be a few days or a week. Every government agency basically doles out paychecks differently. So it's completely possible that if this were to wrap up pretty quickly, you wouldn't get a missed paycheck. But the longer it drags on, if you had something like another 34-day long shutdown, that's potentially 1, 2, even more paychecks that you're not getting. And if you're trying to pay a mortgage, put food on the table, make car payments, utilities, anything. And again, if you're dependent on your paycheck, you don't have much savings. This is especially devastating. And you're supposed to be able to get back pay when the government, isn't shut down any longer, but that can take some time. So, and families don't have time to wait for that. And again, especially devastating over the holidays. So that's the risk that this all poses. And again, the longer it goes, the worse it is for families, and the more benefits and programs that do seem pretty, solid, disruptions become increasingly likely.
I can't imagine how frustrating that could be for families, especially those in the service branches. Hey, I want to ask you, do you have a sense of how the shutdown could affect the wider economy? Is there anything economists are saying, or maybe lawmakers, as they're worried about what's going to come ahead? Maybe they're trying to warn their other colleagues. Are there any ramifications we're going to see with the economy?
Yeah, I don't remember the numbers offhand, but I know GDP took a big hit in the 2018 to 2019 shutdown that happened again over the holidays through the new year. And if I remember correctly, I don't think they were ever to make up that loss over time. So again, it really depends on the duration of a shutdown. If this doesn't last for very long, which is totally possible, the economy at large takes less of a hit. But regardless, it would be, again, devastating for families, not great for the economy. But something I wanted to mention quickly on military families, again, especially if they're active duty and they're considered that accepted class, they have to work and they're going to work without a paycheck. And so in the past, Congress has been able at the last minute, usually, to pass a measure that would ensure pay for people, for people working in the military so that they're working and they're getting a paycheck. I know that there have been some bills trying to do that in Congress that just quite haven't gotten through yet. They're trying to make an exception this time and actually include the Coast Guard because they're funded differently from most military branches. So I think that'll be something to look out for, that if this is looking especially dire, if we're staring at a shutdown towards the end of the week, Congress might be able to pull something together and try to ensure pay for people in the military.
What about the president? What's he saying?
That's something that some reporters asked yesterday on a call with the White House. He was not on the call, but it was someone within the Pentagon. And, we asked about if that's something that would be another possibility, ensuring pay for the military. And they just don't want to talk in hypotheticals. I think if push came to shove, they would want to do that again. But they made the point that it's hard again. You don't even want to call certain employees essential because most jobs would argue that all employees are essential. And so that's why they call them accepted. But, again, and then I talked to Jim Himes about this too from Connecticut. He had said, you start, it's good. You want to ensure pay of the military who protects national security and is serving without pay. But what about all the other employees who are not getting anything? So I think White House, Democrats, other lawmakers, they just don't even want to pose this. They don't want to start picking and choosing who does get paid during a shutdown. They just don't want to have a shutdown at all. And that's basically been the strategy from the White House, is that they just they think Congress should do their job. But it's again, looking as of right now, there is no clear path forward for how they get out of this.
Okay. So that might answer my next question. But, we do have 3 days left to follow all of this, with federal lawmakers potentially being able to do something. So I guess you're saying, and they have until the end of business Friday, or is it pretty much Saturday at midnight? And say that again?
And Saturday at midnight, yeah.
Saturday at midnight. Okay, so what are you thinking? It doesn't look good here in the last couple of days?
I mean, the Senate put out an option to keep the government running for a few months. Republicans in the House aren't currently biting. And so it's going to take compromise in the House. As of right now, they're just pushing ahead on their own bills that will not get anywhere in Congress and thus will not stop a shutdown. It is going to take an extreme amount of pressure over the next few days for someone in the House to budge. And, the scenario where this gets resolved is that, enough Republicans decide to put this on the House floor, they push for it. There's strategies to do that if Kevin McCarthy were not to bring it up. And then Republicans and Democrats would need to vote together. That's been done before. That's typically how short-term continuing resolutions, the CR, typically gets passed, and how they keep the government running until they negotiate larger spending bills. That's really the only path forward. And
potentially 12 bills is that the number there was at one point where Republicans would want to pass 12 bills, some of these ones that are fighting Kevin McCarthy?
Yes, that's how you fund the government through a fiscal year. So it's through that regular order. You pass 12 appropriations bills. And that's the thing too. Actually,
all 12.
I'll quickly add that at least in the last shutdown in 2018, 2019, it was the longest shutdown ever. It technically was only a partial shutdown because they did pass some of those appropriations bills. They've passed none of them through Congress. None of them have been, none of them are law. So this would be a full government shutdown this time because none of those 12 appropriation bills have gotten through. So basically a CR puts a Band-Aid on this, allows them more time to negotiate and pass the 12 appropriations bills.
Lisa Hagen, some say that you're the only person on the Hill that cares about the people. So thank you for coming on the show today and enlightening us all on how the shutdown would impact the people of Connecticut.
Thanks, Frankie. Glad to be back.
Thank you for coming on, and we're going to have to probably hear from you in the next couple of months, especially if we got a CR coming at us that could really extend this into the future. That was Lisa Hagen, federal policy reporter for Connecticut Public and the Connecticut Mirror. Coming up next, what the heck is going on in Bridgeport? Call us if you want to know. 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. We're going to go now from the halls of Congress to City Hall. All eyes are on Bridgeport after video surfaced recently alleging impropriety at the ballot box. That's right, we promised you drama at the ballot box, and here it comes. Joe Ganim, the mayor of Bridgeport, won the Democratic primary earlier this month. But now those results are in question. Stop me if you've heard that before in Bridgeport. His primary challenger, John Gomes, is trying to get the results changed by a local superior court. Joining us now to give you an update on where things stand in Bridgeport, and he's on the Wheelhouse for the second week in a row, so I think I'm just going to give him the job. Maybe he should host this thing instead. Andrew Brown is the investigative reporter for the Connecticut Mirror. You're doing a lot of work here lately, Andrew.
Yeah, it's been a busy couple of weeks.
And now you got to drive to Bridgeport, Fairfield to follow these hearings as well.
Yeah, we were down there on earlier this week for the first hearing in the lawsuit over the election. So I don't think it'll be the last hearing.
Andrew, I want you to do us a favor. First of all, tell folks that if they have any questions about this, or they want to talk about any kind of election stuff in Connecticut, specifically in Bridgeport, 888-720-9677 is the number, 888-720-9677. Can you remind us again what the election results were and why the challenger, John Gomes, thought it was close?
Sure. So on election night, I was at Ganim's party, the mayor's party down in downtown Bridgeport, and the early results that came in from the in-person vote of people showing up to cast their ballots in person on election day actually had Gomes ahead by several hundred votes. But as the city government and the registrar of voters down there started to count the absentee ballots that were cast, Ganim made up that difference and ended up winning according to the preliminary vote count, by 251 votes. So he more than made up for the several hundred votes he was down through this absentee ballot process. There was more than 2,500, maybe 2,600 something absentee ballots that were cast. And Ganim, Mayor Ganim, won a significant number of those. So he ended up pulling out a victory in a very hotly contested Democratic primary for, the second go around. It was a very similar outcome to what happened in 2019 when he faced State Senator Miss Senator Moore. Sorry.
Yeah, don't worry. One time I called her Marilyn Monroe on the air here. It's Marilyn Moore. I don't know. Maybe that's easy to conflate, or I don't know. But anyway, you talked about 2019. So I want to know what the issues were with absentee ballots back then and who was involved. I guess you mentioned Moore and Ganim there, but what were the complaints about absentee ballots back then?
Yeah, there was more, much like Gomes did this time around, really raised objections. I wasn't here back then, so take this for what it's worth. But my reading of the coverage and everybody else's coverage from back then was that Moore thought there were some irregularities in how the absentee ballots were cast. Bridgeport Generation Now, which is an organization down there, actually filed a lawsuit to contest those results, and they had a full hearing of putting people on witness stands, talking about how election essentially campaign workers were going out and providing absentee ballot applications to people, kind of how those applications were filled out, who signed them, and the judge in that case said there wasn't enough evidence to overturn the results of the election, but he essentially said that there was a large amount of evidence that there were improprieties or outright potentially fraud, I think, in some of those absentee ballots that were cast.
And a state regulatory agency, and this came out recently, I saw this in CT Insider, they said that the state regulatory agency recommended charges be brought to 3 people associated with Mayor Ganim. So they're potentially saying that some of the folks that were connected to the campaign should be looked at for criminal charges.
Yeah, the Connecticut Post did a great job prior to the election covering the fact that three essentially campaign workers who were associated with the Ganim campaign in 19 were referred to the state's attorney's office for essentially their mishandling of absentee ballots during that election. So that came out, that referral was handed to the state's attorney's office in June, just 2 months before, 3 months before this September election for the mayoral race.
Eesh. All right, so we have the September primary on the 12th. What's happened afterwards? I looked last weekend at this app on my phone, and all my colleagues at Connecticut Public are communicating about this video in Bridgeport, and there's apparently videotape. What can you tell me about the videotape?
Yeah, so we started hearing rumblings, and others did as well, in the days after the election that the Gomes campaign was saying, that they didn't trust the absentee ballot results. They thought there was, they essentially said that the election was stolen. Gomes said that, the night of the election. And so as the days progressed, we heard rumblings about Gomes potentially having evidence of some sort of absentee ballot fraud potentially. And that evidence was what he says, was produced as essentially on social media on the Saturday after the election. And what it showed, it looks to be surveillance footage from the city's government center where the registrar of voters is located. And it shows a woman dropping what looks like it is handfuls of absentee ballots into a drop box outside that city government center. And so that immediately set off, just chaos in the city election.
The ballot stuffing in Bridgeport.
Yeah. And it ultimately resulted in Gomes filing a lawsuit to ask a judge to set aside the election results and to call a new primary.
We should say that Connecticut Public has not independently confirmed the video's authenticity or the identity of the person in the video. You do that either? Have you guys seen this? I think you and Dave Altamari are working on the story, right? Have you seen if this is something that's authentic?
Well, I mean, we know as much that the city of Bridgeport has been subpoenaed for that actual video, and the police department said in court, a lawyer for the police department has said in court that they are producing that surveillance video. So nobody has said that within the city government has said that this is actually not surveillance video. Now, whether the video has been changed in some way, I can't say. It's hard to tell, right? This was released on social media, but we will find out because this video is now at the center of this lawsuit challenging the election results.
Something to follow, and you got your work cut out for you. But as you mentioned, John Gomes looking for relief in court. Why does he think he should get it? What's he asking for?
He's asking for the essentially the preliminary election results not to be certified by the Secretary of the State. And he's asking for essentially a new primary to be held before the general election in November. So we're on an extremely tight window here. The Superior Court judge who was hearing the case earlier this week essentially recognized the time constraints that everyone is under because of the looming general election. And he has asked the parties in the case, essentially the city, the registrar of voters down there, and both campaigns to essentially work together to try to get all of the evidence processed in time so that they can actually start holding hearings and determining whether Gomes is entitled to a new election or whether the results should stand.
And there's no, and really quickly, there's no idea yet that that there are somewhere like at least 252 votes or something like that were stuffed into the ballot box. So he's asking for the election to be overturned. But is there any evidence thus far that's been presented to say that there is that amount of votes that's been kind of stuffed in?
No, I mean, the video is the crux of his case right now.
Sure.
Again, like you said, 251 votes is a big thing to overcome. It's a huge ask, right? There is a huge burden upon the Gomes team, legal team, to prove that these results should be thrown out, right? A judge would have to essentially agree that there's enough evidence that the results should have been changed. To try to do that, though, the Gomes team has requested 2,000 something hours of video footage from the city
Oh, wow.
of every ballot drop box location to try to determine if this one incident that, they show on social media was representative of potentially larger alleged fraud.
Yeah, you got to imagine that that's going to be a lot of video evidence to pour through, if it can be produced at all. But I just want to ask you, do you got a date, another hearing date, or anything like that scheduled?
They talked about 2 weeks from now having the first evidentiary hearing in which they actually put witnesses on the stand and start hashing out what is truth and what is not.
The State Elections Enforcement Commission, just like it did in 2019, or as a result of the 2019 primary in Bridgeport, looked into what happened there, and now they're looking into it this time around. What are they saying so far?
They I guess it was last week, moved to accept 4 different complaints that were filed by the Gomes campaign in regards to allegations of absentee ballot mismanagement or mishandling. They also accepted 2 referrals from the Bridgeport Police Department in regards to complaints or investigations regarding absentee ballot fraud, potentially. One of those involved the video. Another referral from the police department involved a city council woman in Bridgeport who supported Gomes, apparently illegally entering someone's apartment to search for an absentee ballot. So all of that is on the SEEC's agendas now. They have already gone into Bridgeport and seized every absentee ballot and absentee ballot application that the city managed in the past election. And so they are scouring those records now to try to determine what improprieties may have occurred.
No love lost between the two campaigns. John Gomes used to work for Mayor Ganim, as I understand it. And you mentioned a situation with the councilwoman there. There was that situation where they're alleging breaking and entering. And then on the other side, they're talking about somebody going into a campaign office and harassing workers. It's just been a really hard-fought campaign, maybe approaching the muddy kind of dirty territory here.
I didn't cover the day-to-day elections. I give a lot of credit to the Connecticut Post and other media who were down there day-to-day doing that work. But yes, it's been vicious, I think is the correct word for it. These campaigns clearly have some personal animosity towards one another. And I don't think what has resulted after the election has helped any.
Is Ganim saying anything about this, or his staff? Have they weighed in on this yet?
Ganim, after some silence for about a day or so after the video released, started talking to media reporters and essentially saying that he doesn't condone any types of legal behavior with absentee ballots. And his one thing that he said is that he supports an election monitor for the upcoming November election, but he thinks the results should stand. So.
Yeah, and I saw something because I wanted to reach out too to make sure that we got something from Ganim's side here. They say that the matter is now in the court's hands, and they have full confidence in the courts to conduct a thorough investigation and review. Hey, let's button this up here. Do you know where we go from here? You talked about the judge trying to keep this tight, but is this something that can get resolved before the election? Is John Gomes going to have to then jump back in here now that he's got signatures into the election to try to win in November? How's this going to look, do you think?
It's really, I think they're going to have to hold hearings, and the judge is going to have to make a decision prior to the November election about whether the primary stands. The bigger issue that has already been pointed out is that absentee ballots for the November general election are going to be going out while the judge is hearing this case and just making decisions. So people are potentially going to already be casting ballots in the November election while this is transpiring in court. Gomes is on the ballot already under the independent party line, even if he loses the primary and his legal challenge. And so these two men are going to be facing off in November irregardless, I think.
And potentially Lamont Daniels indicating he'll be staying in the race. And then you got a Republican named David Hers as well. Thank you so much for following this for us, Andrew Brown. Please pay attention to ctmirror.org and Andrew's reporting on this issue. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Andrew came on, and if you want to learn more about Bridgeport politics, stay tuned. Connecticut Public's TAP team will be bringing you even more in-depth coverage in the coming months. Keep up with ctpublic.org for more intel there. Up next, our final piece of business in a busy episode of The Wheelhouse, a special legislative session at the state capitol last week. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. What a mess that Bridgeport primary election is, huh? So much so that it spilled into our next topic in a week where there's a lot going on in politics. I'm talking about the special legislative session at the Connecticut's state capitol taking place this week. A lot going on. And how lucky are we to have here with us to sort it all out? The queen of field reporting in Connecticut, WFSB News Channel 3 chief Capitol reporter, Susan Raff. Good morning, Susan.
Good morning, Frankie. I feel so important when I come on your show. I love it.
I have to. You've always made me feel important. I appreciate it. This is coming right back at you. Join the conversation if you want to call in right now, 888-720-9677. What we talked about in Bridgeport, Susan, is also dominating the conversation at the state capitol this week. Speaker Matt Ritter even led off his pre-session news avail. I heard you there. I heard you were there. So you got to see this. You got a front row seat to this. I'm going to now play this for our listeners so that they can get a big idea of what Speaker Ritter was talking about.
We don't believe the wrecking ball approach is the right one here. I don't know what you get from banning a ballot box in Pomfret, Connecticut. I don't know what that accomplishes other than saying to people who might have gotten their absentee ballot the Saturday before the election, your vote's not going to count. All you're doing is disenfranchising those individuals.
What's he talking about with that wrecking ball approach, Susan?
Well, the speaker's talking about the wrecking ball in response to the Republican proposal and an amendment that was put forth in the legislative session or the special session to ban those drop boxes. Saying that they came about during the pandemic when town halls were closed and we don't need them anymore. But the reality is those drop boxes are used all over the country and they provide great access for people to vote. So the speaker was making a point of saying, don't take these extreme measures and ban these drop boxes, because then you're shutting out a whole number of people who need access to voting.
He talked about the wrecking ball, and then he talked about the scalpel. Is there kind of a more surgical approach that maybe Ritter himself is looking at?
I don't know. A number of proposals were made, and I just want to, clarify the special session was held not to deal specifically with Bridgeport, although it did dominate a lot of the conversation. But one of the things was that Bridgeport had requested a while ago, long before this primary scandal, money for their election. So what they did in the special session was delegate or designate money for an election monitor. And that is someone who will oversee an election. I think it's for 2 years at a cost of $150,000. So that's important that they have that. But Republicans felt that it wasn't enough, that we need more in light of obviously what's happened in Bridgeport before, They wanted to see banning the drop boxes. That did not get enough support. The other thing that they talked about, and it really isn't such a bad proposal, but I don't think that lawmakers can make it happen maybe in the next session, and that is tougher penalties for those who are caught tampering with ballots. Right now, I think it's a $1,000 fine and maybe a maximum of 5 years in prison. But there have been some who have gotten suspended sentences, and some of the Republican amendments, I believe from Representative Craig Fishbein, would have been that you would have to serve a mandatory 1 year. But lawmakers did not tackle that, and I'm not sure if they can actually change, the court system or the sentencing, but we'll see.
And what had to happen in that special session, as Ritter articulated to the media yesterday, was the money essentially went to an agency that said we were the wrong agency to take on this money for an election monitor. And they then passed it back to the state lawmakers to try to figure out in the special session. And then they're now saying that it can go to a different agency that can now release that money and help out with that election monitor in Bridgeport. That's one thing that was dealt with at the special session. Susan, it sounds like lawmakers didn't have the time to tackle the timing of the Connecticut's presidential preference primary in the legislative session that ended in June, but they took it on yesterday, I believe. How'd that go?
Right. They changed the presidential primary. Is that what you're talking about? From April 30th to April 2nd. And that's kind of a win-win. The GOP chairman for the state party, Ben Proto, was there. That's something that Democrats and Republicans both supported because it makes Connecticut a little more relevant. When we have our primary at the end of April, a lot of states have already had their primaries. So it gives the state a little more relevance, a little more momentum. Maybe candidates will come here, and they'll spend money. So that's something that, they would have liked it even earlier, but I think the Democrats had an issue with that, something with their delegates. So it's kind of a win-win for both. But I did want to add yesterday in a surprise visit to the Capitol in relation to Bridgeport, Lamont Daniels came to the Capitol to encourage lawmakers, to get involved. But he also does not support banning these drop boxes. He made a point of saying, a majority of people who live in Bridgeport are Black and brown, and you have to give them access to voting. And I should point out also that, the system did work. There's a camera, there's video. So it did capture something. So there is security. Could the security be better on the drop boxes? Maybe a bit better lighting, better placement. But the camera did catch something, which we'll all find out.
And I think that's the spirit of this whole thing that you have to capture, is that something that's happening in Bridgeport could impact, and I'm not sure this is really going to happen because we do know about the majorities that exist in the state legislature, but it does really seem to have ripple effects for what's happening in the state. I talked to one legislative aide that represented Republicans in the state legislature, and they said, look at that. That's an example of Democrats taking advantage of absentee ballots. So at least it's kind of sowing doubt, or at least it gives maybe a talking point.
Well, I think, and again, Bridgeport has a history of this. I happen to have been around and covered Senator Marilyn Moore, not to be confused with Marilyn Monroe.
That's easy for somebody that's maybe not as professional as they should be all the time as a news anchor to do that. But I apologize.
We spoke with her actually at the courthouse this week. Channel 3 did, because she was at that hearing, and obviously it's eerily reminiscent of what happened back when she ran. The absentee ballot is a huge thing, and there are a lot of concerns about candidates going to nursing homes, trying to get people to fill out absentee ballots, saying, I'll deliver them for you. So those are all things that have plagued Bridgeport for a long time. And there were irregularities found 4 years ago when Marilyn Moore ran, but not enough to call for another election. So I think that's what stopped it, but it still made people think something didn't go right. What happened there? And we need to fix it.
So then two pieces of businesses we've already talked about. They talked about the election monitor. Obviously, they moved the primary up from April 30th to April 2nd. And then lawmakers dealt with the nomination of Nora Danahy to the Connecticut Supreme Court, governor's choice in replacing Maria Arroyo Khan on the bench after she was appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals. Hey, Governor Ned Lamont's last pick to do just that, Sandra Slack Glover, she was a controversial pick, at least the way that lawmakers looked at it, ended up withdrawing her name from consideration. Did this one kind of go better or worse than the last one, Susan?
I would say 100% better. Her hearing went very well. Nora Danahy has quite impressive resume. Her thing with, resigning from the John Durham investigation into Russia when President Trump was in office, those questions were answered. But, it was not a surprise that she sailed through yesterday. But there were some Democrats and even Republicans who did not vote for her, not because they didn't think she was qualified, but because they wanted someone who had more experience with real people. Most of her, pretty much all of her career has been, as a prosecutor. She also worked as a corporate lawyer. So I think they wanted someone to balance out the Supreme Court, because none of the members or the justices now have experience, I guess, with real people, if you want to put it that way. But in the end, she's a very smart woman, and she's going to be an associate justice on our Supreme Court.
Just 20 lawmakers out of 151 voting against the confirmation. And this is going to be the last question. I want you to tell me if this is way too early. You talked about maybe looking at fines for people that violate voting laws in Connecticut potentially being in the next session. You got any ideas of what will be tackled when lawmakers go back to the Capitol in February?
I don't, outside of fines, I really don't. It was funny. I was asking someone about that yesterday, because a lot of things were tackled this year, right? Maybe some money for nonprofits. But I also think that this whole situation where Connecticut has a surplus, but paying down debt, we just don't have the kind of money that people thought. So I don't know, will the Bridgeport election continue to rear its ugly head in February when lawmakers return? Possibly. So we'll have to wait and see. But, there were 25 primaries this month, right? And so only one had issues. So do you throw out the whole system with drop boxes for that? I could see the speaker's point, but clearly something has to be done to restore integrity in our elections.
I barely have 15 seconds left to do this, but I just want to say shout out to your colleague, Brian Elba. After 36 years, he's been so good to me, just as you have, is retiring. So I just want to give you a quick second to shout out Brian.
Oh, that's so wonderful. There's no other person that I would have wanted to spend the past 2+ decades with. He's an extreme professional. He's been my best friend, someone that I have looked up to. I don't know how I'm going to survive, and I feel sorry for all of you. So, but good luck to Brian. I love you, and I hope that you have a good retirement.
Oh, thank you, Susan. That's today's show, which was produced by Meg Dalton. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Thanks to Katie Tolarski for helping us in studio. Download The Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. Thanks for listening.